All right, let's dive into this question we've got. Did the Roman Empire, those guys, did what they did actually end up shaping the East-West thing we still see in Europe today? Like we're talking about their time way back when in Germania.
It's a fascinating question
Mm.
for sure. And, people think of Roman history as like done and dusted. But you're right, it does connect to the bigger picture. You're onto something there.
And the thing is, we've got all these articles, excerpts, the whole shebang to try and unpack it all, right? We're talking big names, Julius Caesar, his brutal campaigns in Gaul. Don't forget that crazy Roman defeat at Teutoburg Forest. And then there's Germanicus coming in trying to avenge that whole thing. I mean, honestly, where do you even begin with a story this massive?
It's less about finding the start and more about getting how each event, it's like a ripple effect through time. Like, look at Caesar's campaigns, right? He actually said he killed 430,000 Eusipides, and contemporary historians still go back and forth about that number.
Wait, 430,000? Even if he bumped those numbers up for propaganda, that's insane.
You're telling me some historians, they say it's got to be exaggeration, but even if it's a fraction of that, we're talking serious devastation.
Right.
And it's not just the numbers. You read Caesar's accounts, and he talks about surprise attacks, camps full of families, not just soldiers, genocide or not. That level of brutality, it had to make the Germanic tribes, yeah, they had to be furious, ready to push back.
And that's where the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest comes in, right? It's like the Romans, they weren't just beat, it was like humiliating. 3 legions gone, wiped out. The kind of loss that sends shockwaves through an empire. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the psychological impact. Tacitus, he wrote about Germanicus visiting that battlefield years later. He finds bones everywhere, skulls nailed to trees, like trophies, like a warning. It showed how vulnerable Rome was, the price they paid for wanting it all.
And you can't forget about those legionary standards they lost, the eagles. This wasn't just about losing some fancy flags, it was symbolic, like losing a piece of who they were. No wonder Germanicus felt the pressure to get them back, to make things right.
For sure. And his whole thing in Germania, it was all about restoring Rome's honor, showing everyone they were still in charge. But he also used those brutal tactics we saw with Caesar's scorched earth, villages burned to the ground. Not pretty. And we see this brutality in what archaeologists are digging up too.
You're talking about Calcareous, right, where they found that Roman cuirass, the one in amazing condition.
Yep, that's the one. That cuirass, every dent, every speck of rust, it's a story of violence. Someone wore that, fought, maybe died in that. Makes it real, not just something in a history book.
It's easy to forget that when you're talking about empires, but those are real people, real lives lost. But even with Germanicus, his willpower, the tough tactics, he couldn't conquer all of Germania, could he?
Nope. Sure, he had some wins, but in the end, they called him back to Rome with the job unfinished. And that right there, that was a turning point. It's like Rome hit a wall, a limit to their expansion.
Okay, so we've got this line in the sand, right? Like, the Romans, this is as far as we go, the Rhine's the border. But how do we get from, like, Roman legions fighting in German forests to this whole east-west divide we're talking about? It feels like a jump.
Yeah, you got to be careful about drawing those straight lines in history. It's not about one thing causing the other, but influence, how things play out over time. Rome not conquering Germania, that had consequences, cultural, political, that lasted.
I see what you're saying. So it's not like the Romans made the east-west divide happen, but what they did kind of nudged things in that direction, yeah.
Right on. Don't forget, the Roman Empire, they weren't just an army. They were like this whole culture machine. Building roads, trade routes, their laws, their language. They spread it all. But the strongest stuff that was inside their borders.
So east of the Rhine, where they weren't as strong, things were going a different way. Different people, different cultures, the whole bit.
Totally. Now, fast forward a bit to when the Western Roman Empire falls apart. Chaos, right?
Mm.
But from that mess, you get the Byzantine Empire over in the east. And here's the thing, they thought of themselves as the real deal. The Roman Empire 2.0, even though they were their own thing, different language, religion, the whole 9 yards.
It's like they needed that Roman connection to feel legit, like they were part of something big and important from history.
Nailed it. And that's when this east-west divide thing really starts to take shape. On one side, the Byzantines holding onto that Roman legacy, and on the other, the new kingdoms popping up in Western Europe, doing their own thing.
And those paths, they didn't exactly meet in the middle, did they? I mean, we're talking about the Great Schism now, right? When the church splits, Catholic West, Orthodox East, that feels like a defining moment in this whole East-West split.
Huge moment. The Great Schism, that was hundreds of years of religious and political arguments coming to a head. Officially, yeah, Christendom splits in two. But some people, they'll say the roots of that split, they go way back to those different identities we were talking about on either side of where the Roman Empire used to be.
So the Roman Empire, even when it was gone, its impact is still there, kind of woven into Europe's story.
That's it. And to really understand how much impact they had, we could look past just the emperors and wars to how people actually lived back then.
So what we're saying is the Roman Empire's effect on this whole East-West divide, it's more than just saying, okay, the army stopped here, end of story.
Right. History's never that simple. Like we've been saying, it's not always a straight line from A to B, more like echoes.
Echoes, I like that. So the Roman Empire, even when it's gone, all its victories, its defeats, they're still echoing down through time, shaping how Europe turned out.
Exactly. And those echoes, they're everywhere. The languages people speak across Europe, legal systems, even how different regions see themselves, their place in the world, it all goes back to Rome. It might be ancient history, but its fingerprints are all over our world today.
That's what makes this so cool. It's not just about dates and battles. It's like the DNA of a whole continent, right?
And like some fancy DNA test, it shows connections you wouldn't expect. Remember how we were talking about the Byzantine Empire, how they held on to that Roman identity? Well, what happens when Constantinople, their capital, the last piece of Rome in the east, what happens when that falls in 1453?
Man, that's the end of an era right there. The Byzantines are done, but I bet the effects were huge, even outside of Constantinople.
Oh, absolutely. One big one. Trade routes get messed up. The Silk Road, that crucial link between East and West, goes haywire.
So now Europe's got to find new ways to get those Asian goods, right? New sea routes, new markets, new everything.
Exactly. Which brings us to this last question for you to think about. Could the discovery of the Americas, that whole world-changing thing, could we see that as a consequence, even if it's indirect, of Constantinople falling? A consequence of all these power shifts we've been talking about that go all the way back to the Romans?
Whoa, that's a wild connection to make. Roman legions, or I guess where they didn't go, centuries later leads to Columbus sailing the ocean blue. Who knew that your question would take us this far?
It just goes to show history isn't separate events. It's all connected, cause and effect, all tangled up. And the coolest discoveries, they often come from making those unexpected connections.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those ripple effects of history. Until next time, when we dive into another mystery from the past.